Okay, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are so excited to be here with Rabbi Zachary Truboff for his book talk on Zionism in Crisis. Rabbi Zachary Truboff is the author of Zionism in Crisis, Jewish Power and Moral Responsibility After October 7th. He serves as the director of the International Beit Din Institute for Agunah Research and Education. His first book was Torah Goes Forth from Zion, Essays on the Thought of Rav Kook and Rav Shagar. Before making aliyah, he served as a synagogue rabbi in Cleveland, Ohio, for nearly a decade. He lives with his wife, Jen, and 4 children in Jerusalem. Thank you so much again, Rabbi Truboff, for being here, and feel free to take it away.
Thank you so much. It's always an honor to be able to teach with Uri L'Tzedek, an organization that is always dear to my heart because of the voice that it's willing to raise in the Orthodox community and beyond on difficult issues, but issues that demand our attention. So, and in many ways, this book fits within that very model, that very need. As was mentioned, I live here in Jerusalem. My family and I made aliyah 8 years ago. And this book emerged from my own personal struggles to reckon with October 7th, and more importantly, with what followed it. I think it's fair to say that the moment that we're in is a pretty complicated and difficult time to be a Jew. I'm not even so sure it's wrong to say it's the most complicated and difficult time to be a Jew since World War II, to be honest. There's a tremendous amount of uncertainty in the world. There's a return of anti-Semitism. There's a return of what was classically called the Jewish problem, which was understood to be the problem of how Jews fit into modern societies, because it seems like we don't, at least not so easily. Zionism was meant to be the solution to these concerns. What it has also proven to be is a problem in its own right, even as it has provided many things that the Jewish people have hoped for, that have dreamed for, on many levels. This particular book emerged from public essays that I was writing after October 7th, in response to what I saw happening in Israeli society and what I saw happening in America and in the Jewish world at large. For me, living here on October 7th meant living through something that is very difficult to describe. I mean, you probably have all read descriptions of it at the level of the news. You've probably all read accounts of how people experienced it, what it was like for people emotionally. But on an existential level, it's hard to describe what it meant like, what it felt like, what it meant, because it was one of those truly rare moments where the floor drops out from underneath you, right? And when the floor drops out from underneath you, what you discover is that you're standing on top of the abyss. And that's what it was. That's completely, 100%, absolutely what it was to be here on October 7th. What made that day unique, especially as somebody who lives in Jerusalem, is that we are not in a position in Jerusalem where we typically hear the sirens go off, the air raid sirens go off. That's something that we associate with like Sderot or other places around Israel that maybe are more the target of rockets. But when the sirens went off here in Jerusalem, right, that was a sign that something had gone very, 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 very wrong. And the sirens went off for hours that day, as really none of us understood exactly what was going on. We were just all, in many ways, terrified. And for me, the defining experience of both October 7th and the months that came afterwards and the various wars that Israel fought was that recurring sound of the sirens, right? If you've lived in Israel the last 2.5 or so years, you've heard the sirens many, many times. And of course, what the sirens mean is something very simple, right? There are rockets, there are missiles, there are bombs coming your way. You better get safe. You better get protected really, really quickly. What I'll note is that for me, the sounds of the siren didn't just become a defining part of the experience. it's a funny part of me trying to make sense of the experience. And what I kept coming back to is a very important teaching of the Rambam Maimonides about how we are supposed to respond to crisis. Right? Judaism has experienced crises before, right? We know this. Jewish history is full of profoundly difficult circumstances. So if there's a tradition that on some level has a sense about how to respond to crisis, you think Judaism would be one of them. And it is. It really is. The Rambam, in a section of the Mishnah Torah called the Hilchot Taniyot, the Laws of Fasts, he has a whole section dedicated to the question of how do we as Jews individually, collectively respond to crisis, right? What are we supposed to do when the crisis comes? Because one of the things that makes Judaism so important is it recognizes the crisis comes. Most of the forms of life that people live in, most of the religions that people live in, the whole point of it is to make you think that everything is safe, secure, and stable. It'll always be stable. The way things are yesterday are the way things are going to be today, and it's going to be the way that things are tomorrow as well. Right? Judaism has an understanding that crisis, not that it can come, but that it will come, right? And it already tries to orient us towards the fact that when it comes, it demands a certain level of response. So what the Rambam notes here in the Laws of Fasts, he says, I'll read the Hebrew and translate, Mitzvotase min haTorah lizot v'lariyah lebachatzotzrot al kol tzara shetavo al tzipor. Every time there is a crisis that the community is facing, you have a positive commandment to sound the chatzotzrot, to sound the silver trumpets. As it says in the Torah and Bamidbar, al atzara tzareretchem v'areotem b'chatzotzrot. Right? The crisis comes, you blow the trumpets. Kol davar sheyitzar lechem kegon batzaret v'dever v'arba u'chayatze behen za'aku alehen v'ario. Right? There's all sorts of crises that can come. The Rambam here just lists what we'd say is like natural crises, cattle sickness or plant disease. But in the Laws of Fast, he goes on to make very clear that one of the core crises that we have to respond to is war. And in fact, the verses in which he learns the obligation to blow the silver trumpets, those verses describe a situation in which war has come to the land of Israel. If you look at them inside, it's striking because what it describes is a moment in which the Jews are in Israel and they are attacked and they are not prepared, right? And they blow the trumpets. A moment very much like October 7th, in ways that to this day still sometimes haunt me. The question is, why are we blowing the silver trumpets? What are they supposed to achieve? If you look at the Torah, at the level of the Torah, the silver trumpets are really understood almost as a cry to God, so that on some level, God should remember us and make sure that we are saved. But that's not the way the Rambam understands them. He actually shifts the meaning in a very profound fashion. Here's what he says. He says, V'davar zeh, right, this matter of the blowing of the silver trumpets, derech medarkei hatshuvahi. It is a path of the paths of tshuva. Shebizman shetavot tzara v'zakula v'yariu, yedu hakol shebiglal ma'aseh maraim hara lahen. Kechatuv amenotechem atu elu. Lachem v'zehu sheyigrom lehem la'asir atzara me'alehem. What the Rambam is saying here is that you blow the trumpets because it's part of what tshuva demands, right? And for the Rambam, this is what's so important. Crisis always demands us to respond with tshuva. Crisis always demands that we respond with some level of introspection to ask ourselves, where are we in relation to it? And more importantly, what is our responsibility to it? Here, the Rambam frames it in terms of almost causality, right? The crisis came because I did something wrong. So when the crisis comes, I better do tshuva so I can fix what I did wrong, right? To prevent the crisis from becoming truly catastrophic. But that's the logic that he points out here. The problem with this approach, of course, if you know anything about the Rambam is famously a rationalist. He does not believe that God sends lightning bolts down from heaven to punish people who have done sins, right? And that's what it sounds like he's describing here. You sin, the crisis comes, right? It's deserved punishment in a sense. But if you look at the Rambam more collectively, if you look at his discussion of crises in the Guide for the Perplexed, it's clear that he doesn't understand it in terms of causality, but he recognizes that we as human beings have a natural inclination in moments of crisis, and it is not to look inward. It isn't, right? We might think the moment of crisis is the moment that we'll finally look at ourselves honestly, right? Because it's literally the moment when our world is crumbling around us. But that's not what happens. When the crisis comes, People will do everything they can not to have to look at themselves in the mirror. It's just human nature. And what the Rambam is noting here is that when the crisis comes, you're going to have to look inside yourself, right? That's why we're blowing the silver trumpets. That's why we're hearing the siren, because on some level, right, it's not just about gathering the Jews. It's not just about a cry out to God. It's about we have to look at who we are. It's not easy because when a crisis comes, let's be honest, I've already said we're not going to look at ourselves. So what are we most likely going to do, right? When crisis comes, we're most likely to try to find somebody to blame. We're most likely to try to find someone we can point the finger at and say, they are the reason why this awful thing is happening. Certainly not me, but there is where it is. And once you find your scapegoat, right, you have one, thing you have to do, one mitzvah, right? Kill the scapegoat. Now, I lay all this out because, as I said, for me, the sirens of October 7th and the sirens in the war that followed were a call to tshuva, a call for me to have to look at myself and where I was in relation to this mess. And more importantly, I felt a call for Israeli society, a call for really all Zion, and who identifies with Zionism, to have to look at themselves and say, where are we in relation to this? What is my responsibility to this? Right, there's another point that Rambam doesn't say explicitly, but it's somewhat implicit, which is that you may not be guilty for the crisis, but you are absolutely responsible for whatever comes next, for whatever you choose to respond to it, right? You don't get off the hook. You may not have brought it upon yourself, but you are responsible for what comes next. And the Rambam's emphasis on tshuva in that moment of crisis, I think, is essential at ultimately, getting at that. Now, part of what makes the idea of tshuva so difficult after October 7th and during these wars of the last 2.5 years were the great threats that Jews, both in Israel and America, felt that they were facing. And when you face a real threat, an honest-to-goodness threat, and Lord knows Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, we can go down the list. They were, they still very much are real threats, right? When you're facing that kind of world, again, you're not going to want to look inward. It's just simply, you don't feel you have the luxury to do that. You feel you're acting out of necessity. You feel you're acting towards your survival. Now, I think what was particularly difficult for me living in Israel is that October 7th was, as I said, a shock, a catastrophe, a moment in which I felt I was standing over the abyss. But October 7th also had a strange sense of familiarity to it because I lived in America for September 11th, right? I remember exactly what that feeling was like when I heard the planes went into the towers, right? And again, it was exactly a moment where the impossible happens, right? The thing that can't happen, right? The heart of New York City, the heart of American power, the heart of American wealth, right? To just blow up like that, right? To have an enemy who can somehow reach into the very heart of who you are and destroy it and not even understand as an American why this was happening, right? On many levels, it was just as much a crisis, a shock. And I remember what followed September 11th. I remember the national trauma. I remember feeling the self-righteousness that comes with knowing that you're facing an enemy that you believe to be truly evil. And I know the decisions that get made in that kind of environment. I remember supporting the invasion of Iraq, certainly the invasion of Afghanistan. I remember thinking, we're the strongest country in the world, right? There's bad guys out there. Somebody's got to pay, right? But at the very least, we're going to make the world a little bit safer. It took me years to recognize that the decisions that were made by America after September 11th did not necessarily make America safer. And it did not necessarily make the world a safer place. Because when you are experiencing collective trauma, national trauma, it often tends to distort our thinking and the way that we're looking at the world far more than it helps sharpen it. That's part of the challenge with crisis. Crisis is a moment in which you can feel that it brings great clarity, right? Because you now know it's all or nothing. It's survival or death. It's the enemy or us, right? That's the kind of world that crisis can generate. And it can be deeply clarifying, right? You can finally feel this is what it means to be alive. This is what it means to have to fight for things that truly matter. But that sense is often more an illusion than we might think. And it's an illusion that we often create for ourselves to deal with a world that suddenly makes no more sense to us. Now, I supported initially the war going into Gaza. I am not a pacifist. I mean, the things that Hamas did on October 7th are as evil as anything in many ways the Nazis did to the Jewish people. And again, I use the Nazi comparison only because the efforts of the Nazis and the efforts of Hamas on October 7th were intended to dehumanize the Jews. They were intended to erase the humanity of the Jews, right? That was literally the way the acts were perpetrated, right? At the same time, right, I going into Gaza, it was very clear to me, and it was probably very clear to most of us, right? It might be necessary, but my God, what is going to come next, right? The whole point of October 7th, and I think everybody here is aware of this, right? Hamas's goal was to drag Israel into a war with Gaza, right? Hamas's goal was to use its civilians as shields, right? It wasn't a surprise what potentially was going to come next. And during the opening weeks of the war, I mean, we saw Israel in a position in which it was struggling to make sense of the impossible, right? Its sense of safety having been completely shattered, and acting as best as it could, but also in a traumatized fashion to try to make itself more safe, whatever exactly that might mean, right? To bring the hostages home, whatever exactly that might have meant. I think what was particularly difficult for me was watching the discourse in Israeli society, watching the kind of language and rhetoric that reverberated everywhere, and also knowing on some level it's not possible that politician after politician, community leader, cultural leader can get up and say things that are, again, about dehumanizing Palestinians in Gaza or dehumanizing all sorts of things, right? And expect that on some level that is not going to impact the way that Israel wages war. And again, I'm not a military expert. I will not claim any specific knowledge about the way Israel fought in Gaza and be able to tell you that 3.1 civilian deaths to every terrorist or 5.1 or 8.1 or 1.6 or any of this is either knowable or meaningful. But I can describe for you what it was like as an Israeli citizen watching this unfold. And what I saw happening was many, many bombs killing many, many civilians and many, many situations in which maybe 100 civilians or more would be killed just to get one or two terrorists, right? In the Israeli society around me, as I watched this play out, I saw people believe this to be necessary, believe it would be necessary for survival. How can we let Hamas win? If you let them hide behind human shields, Hamas wins. How are we ever going to get the hostages home without being able to really eviscerate Hamas? It just won't happen. I think one of the turning points for me was when 3 hostages had escaped from Hamas in Gaza and were gunned down by Israeli soldiers, right? That was a devastating moment. It's still not a moment, unfortunately, that's being talked about enough. And literally just a couple of weeks later or soon afterwards, there was an Israeli citizen who had killed a Palestinian terrorist in Jerusalem, who was then gunned down by an off-duty soldier, an Israeli soldier, who basically seemingly thought the guy who actually killed the terrorist was himself a terrorist, except for the fact the guy that killed the terrorist was sitting on the ground with his hands up, begging for his life as the off-duty soldier, shot him dead. And there's plenty of video on this. You can go look it up. And even more recently, the mother of one of those hostages who was killed in Gaza, she's been pushing the IDF for to reveal its own inspection and reports around the incident. And she has spoken to other soldiers who were there that day, and this was in the news. I can send the link if you're interested afterwards. Let know Uri L'Tzedek. You can probably even Google it. The soldiers she spoke to made clear that their orders were shoot anything that moves. Shoot anything that moves, right? And you can imagine in both of these cases, if this is what is happening to Jews, whether it's in Jerusalem or Gaza, you can certainly imagine what's happening to everybody else. Now, again, I'm not claiming there's moral clarity in these moments or things are obvious or easy. But what I saw is a society that seemingly lost the ability to look at itself and ask hard questions about what it was doing and why it was doing it and what it was ultimately achieving. One of the things that seemingly happened in Israeli discourse was basically any question that you could raise about the wars, about October 7th, could be deflected, right? If you question whether or not the war was just, whether or not the war was achieving the things that Israel said it was achieving, there was one answer everybody could give. Remember October 7th. That's why we're doing this. right? If we don't keep doing this, we're going to have more October 7th, right? If you question the fact that so many Palestinian civilians were being killed, right? There was an answer that would come immediately, right? Hamas uses them as human shields, right? It's not Israel's fault. It's Hamas's fault if they die, right? And if you raised any concerns about the fact that significant parts of the world were expressing concern about the way the war was being fought, right? Again, there was a ready-made answer there for you. It was, they're all anti-Semites. Don't you remember that? Why is Israel being singled out for special treatment, right? Look at World War II. Look at what the U.S. did in Dresden, right? Like, therefore, again, how dare anybody think that what's being said about Israel during this war is anything other than a bunch of anti-Semites who hate Jews? The ultimate problem with all of this was, on some level, I had told myself that Israeli society, when pushed to the limit, would still be able to ask itself hard questions, that it would still be able to maintain a certain internal moral discourse about things. And I have to be honest, at least for me, where I was sitting, and there may be other Israelis who feel differently. There are other Israelis who were served in Gaza, who have a different perspective than I have. And I don't claim that I know God's truth in this. But from where I was sitting, it seemed like the capacity to do that just evaporated. And the reason I felt that on a certain level was that as I looked around me and I looked at the sort of rabbis and community leaders and politicians who I'd always told myself, when stuff really gets bad, thank God they're there. They'll say something. They'll do something. But as things got worse and worse, that's not what happened, right? That's not what happened, at least as I saw it. They were silent mostly. And to me, that was in some ways the most horrifying thing of all, because when the abyss opens up underneath you, what you do is you look around to see who's with you. And at least in that moment, if there are people beside you, you can essentially hold each other's hands and find a place to stand. But when you're standing over the abyss and you look around and there's nobody beside you, there's only one thing: you're going to fall, right? You're going to fall in. One of the things that's hard as a rabbi, as somebody who cares about asking hard questions, who cares about moral nuance, is that even though the Torah may be written black ink on white parchment, right? I think we all know this. The Torah is all about the gray, right? The Torah is all about the fact that there are always going to be hard questions. There are always going to be unanswerable questions, and that responsibility can't be erased, even when it's not fair, even when it feels like it's just simply too much for us. And as I said, when it came to the hard questions, right? Was it permissible to starve 2 million people? Was it permissible to kill as many children as necessary? All in the name of freeing the hostages and defeating Hamas. It felt to me, at least inside Israeli society, that we couldn't even have conversations around that. Now, I also, in addition to the Torah work that I do, I also happen to be somebody who has a great and deep abiding love for Zionism. Most of the good things in my life have come to me through Zionism, through Israel. I want to be very clear about that. My wife I met through Israel activism in college. I only truly came to study Torah, love Torah, through my time in Israel, through studying Torah in Yerushalayim. My oldest son was born here. When we had to leave 20 years ago, I just kept dreaming about coming back, and somehow we finally managed to come back. And my children have grown up here, right? Israel has given me tremendous things. So when I raise these questions, these concerns, it comes from a place of loving something so much and feeling that you owe it so much that when problems like this emerge, you have to say something. You have to do something. As I said, I'm a student of Zionism, Zionist history, Zionist thought. And as I was trying to process all this that was happening, I came across a line by Vladimir Jabotinsky. Vladimir Jabotinsky is, in my opinion, probably the most important Zionist thinker. Certainly the most important Zionist thinker as it comes to political thought, to pre-state thought, right? He's the most prolific Zionist thinker. He writes, again, thousands and thousands of pages of essays. And he's thinking. Jabotinsky is thinking. He's actually somebody who is asking hard questions. That's what separates Jabotinsky from other pre-state thinkers. Jabotinsky defines himself by somebody who's willing to ask the hard questions. And in his most important essay, at least his most well-known essay, The Iron Wall, he asks a very hard question, right? The Iron Wall is an essay in which he is reconciling with the fact that the Jews came back to Palestine, but there is another people there. And that other people that is there, they don't really want Zionism. And even worse, Jabotinsky acknowledges this. They're right not to want Zionism, because Zionism means a Jewish majority in Palestine, which means the Arabs who are there who become Palestinians, right? They're going to lose the sense that Palestine is a land that belongs to them. You become a minority, you lose that. And he says, I understand why they're fighting back against Zionism. I get it, right? It makes sense. He essentially implies, if I was in their position, I would do the same thing. But he goes on to argue in a second essay called Ethics of the Iron Wall that it's still necessarily just for Zionism to do what it needs to do, right? The Jews are suffering. The Jews have nowhere. If you have a people like the Arabs who have so much land and a people like the Jews who have no land, right? Fairness demands that something be given from those who have too much to those who have none at all, right? It's a legitimate argument. It's an argument that certainly resonates with me to one degree or another. And he recognizes on some level Zionism is unfair to the Palestinians and the Arabs, but justice demands that it be seen through. But Jabotinsky also knows that answer is not quite good enough. And at the end of the Iron Wall essay, right, he says as follows. He says, again, he's trying to grapple with Zionism's morality. He says, Zionism moral and just. Two brief remarks. He says, in the first place, if anyone objects that this point of view is immoral, Zionism, right? Zionism that is going to be built to some extent on the backs of the Arabs, the Palestinians who live there. He says, I answer, it is not true, right? Either Zionism is moral and just, or it is immoral and unjust. But that is a question that we should have settled before we became Zionists. Actually, we have settled that question, and in the affirmative. But if you're a Zionist, the answer is Zionism is moral and just. End of story. He says that. We hold that Zionism is moral and just, and since it is moral and just, justice must be done. No matter what Joseph or Simon or Ivan or Ahmed agree with it or not, there is no other morality. Now, I have a great respect for Jabotinsky, but I hope you see what he's doing here. He is recognizing on some level that there's a problem, that Zionism is doing things that have costs, that have real consequences, that produce real suffering for people that on a certain level don't deserve it. Again, my claim here is not that Zionism should go away. Zionism isn't going away. But the problem with what Jabotinsky does here is when he is confronted with gray, he wants to turn it back to black and white. When he's confronted with the fact that Zionism achieves both good and bad, he wants to erase the bad and say that it's only good. And it's very natural because most of us can't really grapple most of the time when we do things for the right reasons that hurt other people. Right? It's very hard for us to grapple with that kind of reality. It's just something that almost doesn't compute for us. But if there's something essential to being a Jew, it's that we never get to close the door on these kinds of questions, on these kinds of situations. When we confront the gray, we have to learn to live with it. And Zionism, as Jabotinsky describes here, and as what I saw at least after October 7th, was a moment where it was too overwhelming to really have to face that, to recognize that you cannot just solve all problems by saying Zionism is moral and just, end of story. Now, where does that leave us? Part of the challenge that we face when we experience crisis, and the Rambam, again, is very, very clear about this, is that a crisis is rarely a one-time thing. And how we choose to respond to a crisis will often determine what comes next in the future. And the Rambam is very concerned if we don't respond to crisis with tshuva. And he says as follows, I'm reading here from the Rambam again, Hilchot Taniyot, Parak Aleph, Halacha Gimel, Avalim lo yizaku, if you don't cry out with the silver trumpets, v'lo yariu, and you don't blow them, elo yomru, davar ze miminhaga olam yira lanu, if instead you just say, this is just the way of the world, things happen, right? It's not my fault, right? People do things, right? Earthquakes happen, right? Stuff is just the way it is. It's not really up to me. And he says, Vitsarazo nikro nikrit, right? Basically saying if you treat this as something totally contingent, right? Something you're totally not responsible for. He calls this harezo derech achzariyut, that this is the way of cruelty. If you don't respond with tshuva to a crisis, it is actually cruel. Why? He goes on to say, because you keep doing the things you were doing wrong. And this is the key thing, the crisis comes back. right? The crisis comes back, right? Famous line of Freud, that which is repressed always returns, right? If you can't face it, you will not escape it. He continues, "Ushikatu b'Torah v'lachtem imi b'keri v'lachtem imichem b'chamot keri kolomar kshavia lechem Sarah kadesh tashuvu im tamrushu keri osif lechem chamat od keri oto keri." Right? If you respond to the crisis by basically saying, "I don't have anything to do with this, it really isn't my fault. I don't even know what you're talking about with this tshuva stuff." If that's the way you respond to crisis, you are essentially almost guaranteeing that the crisis will come again in the future. And what makes this so striking is the Rambam doesn't say this, but he seems to at least now explain why is it that not doing tshuva after crisis is cruel. Because if you don't do tshuva after crisis, you guarantee on some level that it will return, and you condemn the future to further suffering. That's what makes it cruel. What makes it cruel is you basically say, "I'm not responsible," and you condemn those who come after you, or even yourself, right, to suffer inordinately again when the crisis returns. When you look at Zionist history, you see a lot of crises. You see a lot of what we might even call miracles. We see amazing things, right? Zionism has achieved unbelievable things that we should all be proud of, things that we should sing songs to, things that we should treasure and cherish. But in all those crises, right, and those crises tend to revolve around a singular set of issues, around Israel's relationship to the Palestinians, around Israel's relationship to the Arab countries that surround it, right? In relation to those crises, if the question is, has Israel really grappled with things? My sense of it is not nearly as much as it needs to. And I know that might sound harsh, because given the world we Jews face, it seems so deeply unfair. But part of the challenge of being Jewish, part of the challenge of God giving us the Torah, is that there is no footnote. There is no clause that if you look at in the Torah that says just because things are hard, you don't have to do the hard work that God demands of us. And God always demands of us, right? This is the basic lesson of the Nevi'im, of the prophets, that when bad things happen, we have to look at ourselves and ask, where are we in relation to this? Are we responsible in some way? How can we act differently to prevent this from happening again? I guess what I want to, try to bring home here is the question of what it might mean for Zionism to do tshuva. A question that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. The first thing I want to note is that the idea that Zionism and tshuva are related is not just something that emerges from the notion of crisis itself, though in a certain sense, maybe it does. Because Zionism itself is a response to a crisis, right? As I started with it, the Jewish problem, right? The inability for Jews to find a home within the modern world, right? And it wasn't just they couldn't find a home, right? The Jews had to face violence and oppression wherever they turned, right? In that crisis, right, one, not the only one, but the one that in a certain sense matters most today, the Jewish response that is most significant was that of Zionism. It was saying we can return to our homeland, we can build a life for ourselves there, we can build a state there, right? We can find a place where the abyss doesn't open up. We can find a place to stand, right? Zionism was in itself a response to crisis. And on some level, Herzl understood that Zionism itself was meant to be a form of tshuva. Why? Because if the Jewish problem is the crisis of being a Jew in modernity, the crisis of anti-Semitism, then on some level, Zionism was about taking responsibility, right? Zionism was about saying we have to be responsible for ourselves, for each other, for all of us. Because if we don't do it, nobody will. I think Herzl understood that. And on some level, Zionism was always about responsibility, right? It really was about who are we? Who are we to each other? And in Herzl's address that he gives at the First World Zionist Congress in 1897, he actually says this. He notes something very interesting. He notes that in the eyes of most non-Jews, Jews are looked at as being how you might say, thick as thieves, right? Like even today, right? Sort of an anti-Semitic trope, but it's in some ways true. Like Jews are known for sticking together. Jews are known for having these, thick ties that bind them to one another, right? That's the sort of perspective that the world has when they look at the Jews, right? Famously, right? Who dominates the diamond trade, or at least at different times and places, who has dominated the diamond trade? The Jews. Why have Jews dominated the diamond trade? I don't know if people know this, right? To distribute diamonds, it requires, to do it effectively and efficiently, it's a high trust industry, so to speak, meaning you need people who can make deals and trust each other that those deals are going to be followed through, because it involves moving around very high amounts of capital and high value objects, right? And so you need people who can, trust each other, get along well together, right? And know how to keep coming back and working together, right? That's why Jews dominated the diamond industry, because they had those kind of high trust, thick connections with each other. But here's what Herzl actually notes in 1897. He notes, by the time Zionism emerges, Jews aren't maybe as close as the Goyim might have thought, right? The Jews had actually started to drift apart a bit, right? Because anti-Semitism and assimilation meant that Jews weren't the kind of community that they were back in the shtetl, back in the ghetto, right? Jews were all kind of individually making their way in the world. And as such, Jews were not as closely tied as they had been, right? And what he said with Zionism is he saw it as a force in which it was bringing Jews together again. As I'm saying here, bringing us together to take responsibility for each other, for what is happening to us, right? Zionism was not supposed to be about woe is me, right? Zionism is supposed to be about now what, right? Where are we in this? What can we do about this, right? Here's what he says. He says, since time immemorial, the world has been misinformed about us Jews. The sentiment of solidarity with which we have been reproached so frequently and so acrimoniously was in process of disintegration at the very time we were being attacked by anti-Semitism, meaning Jews were criticized for being too close with each other, right? And only caring about, their fellow Jews. But Herzl's noting by time 1897, assimilation has weakened that tremendously. And he says anti-Semitism on some level served to strengthen it anew, to bring Jews back to each other, right? If you're in the kiruv business, if you're in the Jewish education business of building Jewish identity, oh my God, anti-Semitism is like the greatest thing, right? Because anti-Semitism brings Jews back to Judaism, right? That's one of the things that it does, right? But here's the way that Herzl describes it. He says, in describing Zionism, he says, we returned home, as it were, right? Zionism is a return home. Now, you might think he's referring to, of course, Palestine, Eretz Israel, right? That is the Jewish home, right? Zionism is about bringing the Jewish people home. But that's not what he says in the speech. He says, first and foremost, Zionism is a return to Judaism, even before it is a return to the land of the Jews. Zionism is a return to Judaism, even before it is a return to the land of the Jews, right? Which means, in Herzl's eyes, Zionism is a form of tshuva. It is a form of bringing us back into relationship with the things that we had become disconnected from. And it's about not just bringing us back into relationship, but recognizing our responsibility to them and for them. I think one of the hardest things about being a Zionist and almost being an Israeli these days is that Zionism was all about agency, right? Zionism was all about saying you're a powerless people, you poor, pathetic Jews. We're going to find a way to stand on our two feet. We're going to find a way to act. We're going to find a way, as I keep saying, right, to ultimately decide our own destiny, right? We are going to be masters of our own destiny. It's the language that Ben Gurion uses repeatedly. In galut, in exile, we are dependent on others, which means we are vulnerable, which means the worst things can happen to us. But Zionism is about taking agency into our own hands, to taking our destiny into our own hands. When you are trapped in crisis, and when you're trapped in a repetition of crisis, what you start to actually recognize on some level is your own powerlessness, right? In the decade plus, or I should say, from basically the time of the disengagement from Gaza until October 7th, 2023, right? Israel was not overly engaged in trying to solve the conflict with Palestinians, right? Good reasons for it. Second Intifada was brutal and terrifying, right? But for 20 or so years, Israel basically said, we're doing the best that we can. We're managing the conflict, right? They've shown they can't be partners for peace. we're just going to have to defend ourselves. Occupation is going to be there. It's going to be brutal, but you know what? It's necessary. What can we do? Right? That kind of thinking, I would argue on some level, is not exactly Zionist thinking. Anytime as a Zionist you have to respond to a situation or a problem and say, what else can we do? I would argue on some level that's not very Zionist. Because when you say, what else can we do? What you're basically saying is you have no choice. Ein brera. That's the language Zionists use in his history. But when crisis comes and you're doing tshuva, you're trying to take responsibility, part of what tshuva does is it enables you to see that the way you had been looking at the world maybe isn't the only way to look at it. That where you saw no options, perhaps there might have even been possibilities. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying that a clear path suddenly opens up before us. But one thing we have to recognize is that when we find ourselves trapped in repetition, when we find ourselves trapped not being able to act or acting in ways that seemingly don't produce the results that we want. And I say this today on a day when Israel has already concluded its second war with Iran the last year, a war that I saw in Israeli news reports today. And again, you can look them up yourselves. What are the reports saying now? Iran wasn't really damaged, not nearly as much as America and Israel had been publicizing, right? That Iran's missile capability, that Iran's other types of military capabilities were not really so damaged as people might think, and that it retains the ability to strike, and it is rebuilding them, as we speak, right? And when I keep saying about crisis, tshuva, repetition, again, that's what life has been like in here, Israel, since October 7th. For me, at least, the only way to break that is by beginning to ask ourselves hard questions as Jews, as Zionists, about what we're doing, what we've done, where is our responsibility in all of this? As Jews, we shouldn't be afraid of hard questions. We shouldn't be afraid because we're the one people on this planet whose self-identity has been built around a willingness to ask hard questions, harder questions than anybody else out there. That's kind of what made it special about being a Jew, is that we asked the things that nobody was willing to ask, because we're the only people who, I keep saying, had to stand over that abyss more than once and stare it in the face and find a way to keep going. I think I'm going to end here. And I would like to open up for questions if anybody has any they'd like to ask or share. Daniel, I see you have your hand up.
Thank you, Rabbi Truboff. That was a very thought-provoking talk, and I'm very excited to read your book. The question I have for you is this: it seems to me that, the general sort of tenor of what you're arguing makes an enormous amount of sense to me. And if we can't, reflect on our failures, moral and strategic, we're certainly in a very bad way. But I wonder if you could say something theologically about the perils of blaming ourselves for catastrophes. And in particular, something I would notice is that, it seems that we have enough to ask forgiveness for example, for the treatment of Palestinians by settlers in the West Bank, and for things that are happening now that are seem abundant violations of all our principles. But it seems to me that if you follow Rambam's Hilchot Ta'aniyot in the way that you've been suggesting, we might be taken to asking the question, do we owe some kind of tshuva for October the 7th itself? And that seems to me extremely problematic. And it's always struck me as very interesting that with enough time separating us from an incident, we're able to take that perspective. For example, the rabbis gave all kinds of reasons that we were responsible for the destruction of the two temples, but we don't do that with respect to the Shoah, and we regard it as abhorrent when people imply that the Jews were responsible for that. So how theologically do you understand, theologically and morally and practically, do you understand the, the um, how we might, sort of draw an effective line
So you
between
you raise a
things?
really important point, Daniel. And we have to begin by being willing to separate between guilt and responsibility. Part of the problem for me, that those two things are very, very different from each other. And I know when I say responsible, it can sound like I said causality, right? Like we caused it, right? I want to be very clear. The only people who are guilty of October 7th are the Hamasnikim who picked up guns and went into Jewish homes and slaughtered parents and children side by side, and did the most awful things imaginable, right? Nobody can be guilty of that other than them. It just doesn't work that way. I mean, it doesn't work any other way, right? Guilt attaches to actions that you knowingly and willingly do, and that is just what it is. But responsibility can still exist even when there's not guilt. And this is a Jewish theological idea, and it is also a philosophical idea. It is a Jewish theological idea, and I have an essay on this in the book, in which I'll give you the example. King David, right? So at a certain point, King David is fleeing from King Saul. King Saul wants to kill him. David flees to the city of Nov, right? Nov is a city of priests, of Kohanim, and they take care of David. They take David in, they provide him food, and they provide him shelter. And David is very grateful for this, right? And he ends up leaving Nov. But in the midst of this, Shaul sends somebody after David, right, to try to find him, goes to Nov, find that they had been covering for David, hiding for David, and that person ends up ultimately destroying the city or killing a large number of people there, right? And the Gemara Masechet Sanhedrin depicts it as God turning to David and saying that on some level, David, you have to accept responsibility for that, right? Because on some level, your choice, you went there, right? On some level, you have to know that, like, if the king is coming after you, anybody who helps you might be in danger, right? And again, responsibility is there. It doesn't mean he's guilty for it. He didn't kill those people, right? But responsibility still remains. And we see this throughout the Jewish tradition. We do tshuva for sins that we didn't intend, right? B'shogeg, right? That's the language. We say it. We pound our chests on Yom Kippur. We say al chait for sins that we didn't intend, things that we didn't intend, right? It's crazy, right? We think sin, we think guilt only attaches to intentionality. But again, the Jewish tradition recognizes that responsibility extends beyond guilt. And the problem in crisis, when crisis comes, is that it is so overwhelming to us, it becomes a moment in which we deny any and all responsibility for what happened, right? I can give you this also in the language of the philosopher Hegel, right? Hegel notes in the Phenomenology of Spirit that we always act not knowing what the full consequences will be, not having all the information that we need to even calculate what the full consequences could be. And we also act never being in full control of the meaning of our actions, because whatever we do when we act, other people interpret it as too, right? You probably had this experience. You did something you thought was for the right reasons, and somebody else either misinterpreted or interpreted it differently and were genuinely hurt by it. And you know what? You can't go up to them and tell them, guess what? You're wrong because I didn't mean that, right? Because they experienced the action, and every individual has the right to interpret an action from their perspective as they experienced it, right? You can't just tell them they're wrong and say, you shouldn't be upset, right? Hegel's point to a certain extent is that because we act never really knowing what the full consequences will be, and never being fully in control of the meaning of our actions, that doesn't mean we get to escape from responsibility for what comes next. Because if we don't take responsibility for what comes next, then that means we act without actually really acting with full awareness of what that means, right? Agency, freedom, these things require, these not just like rights that are given to us. These are things that require us being fully cognizant of the world that we're in, the constraints that we are under, and still saying, I get that, and I'm still going to act, and I'm still going to take responsibility for what comes next. Israel is not guilty in any way whatsoever for October 7th, but is Israel responsible for the conditions that produced October 7th? That's a question that I think we have to spend some time with, right? And that's a question here in Israel that we have been constitutionally incapable of asking ourselves, in large part because there is no state commission, right, that is meant to investigate why October 7th happened. And in fact, our political leaders are doing everything they can to prevent such a commission from ever taking place, right? A state commission is not the equivalent of tshuva, but a state commission at least gives you a sense of the kind of self-examination that tshuva requires. And you can see how without it, right, responsibility just floats, right? Nobody's responsible. Bibi had an interview with 60 Minutes a week or two ago. And he actually at one point said something that he has not said in Israeli public at all. He said on some level, he's like, I'm responsible. He's like, but everybody in government is responsible, right? The crisis took place under our watch. And of course, if everybody is responsible, then I think we all know that no one is responsible, right? Responsibility is not an easy thing. But if there's one reason God gave the Torah to the Jewish people, we just had the holiday of Shavuot this past week, right? Every Shavuot night, I like to learn Torah with my kids. I don't like giving shiurim in communities. I don't want to be up at 3 a.m. teaching. It's not very fun. It kind of ruins the next day. I like learning at home with my kids. And this year for Shavuot, we learned Rabbinic Agadot, Talmudic Agadot. We studied, one of them we studied was the Tanor Shel Achnai, right? The oven of Achnai, which is a famous rabbinic debate in which most of the rabbis have one opinion about the purity status of the oven. Eliezer ben Horkenes has a different opinion, right? Eliezer ben Horkenes thinks he's right. Eliezer ben Horkenes has lots of proofs he can bring the other rabbis that he's right. They don't listen to him. Eliezer ben Horkenes says, you know what? If I'm right, will this tree get uprooted and fly in the air 100 feet? And the tree gets uprooted and flies in the air 100 feet, right? And if I'm right, the stream that's going this way, going downstream, the stream's supposed to go, is going to go the opposite direction. It's going to go upstream. And that's what happens. The water goes the reverse direction, right? And he says, if I'm right, the walls of the Beit Midrash will come tipping over, right? And that's actually what begins to happen. The sugya turns on the words of Rabbi Yoshua. Rabbi Yoshua, basically speaking for all the rabbis, says, I'm sorry, Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkenes. On some level, you might be right. In fact, it's part of the story. A bat kol, a heavenly voice, comes down and tells other rabbis that Eliezer ben Horkenes is right. But Rabbi Yeshua says at the end of the day, lo b'shamayim hi. Right? The Torah may be mina shamayim, but it is lo b'shamayim now. Right? It is not in heaven now. It comes from heaven, but right now it's in our hands. And the whole point of that story is, even if you're right, Eliezer ben Horkenes, even if God thinks you're right, doesn't matter, because we're responsible now. Right? That's what it means to be a Jew. On some level, my deepest belief in Zionism stems from that, but I often worry that sometimes Zionism becomes a framework in which Jews try to escape responsibility for very, very difficult things. And I understand it. Like, we've had to face problems like nobody else in the world. But if it becomes a framework for escaping responsibility, it becomes a framework that works against what it means to be a Jew on some level. Fred, and then maybe Gerald.
Yes, Zach. It's really interesting to hear your words. Wanted to kind of ask two questions. The first is the conflation between, I think, agency and power. Because I feel like October 7th, really there was no government. For at least 24 hours, there was basically no government.
Yes.
And so the basic argument of agency was completely undermined on October 7th. So the assertion of almost unlimitless power may be coming and rooted in the Zionist narrative of agency itself, even though there's been no political agency, or some sort of grand idea that by exercising power, we can recreate everything, even Iran and the Middle East and everything in our liking, which you hear from various politicians. So I wanted to ask how you might respond to that, because it sounds like there's only, in terms of agency, there's only one tool in the toolbox that seems to be applied. And the second question I have is the issue of moral critique. As a Jewish communal leader, I found it very difficult to talk about nuance, because very often our words are being weaponized in a very Machiavellian way, where like our words are like then turned against us. I signed something with Rabbi Blau many months ago, as you probably know. Yep. You did too. And next thing I see, the New York Times has me like quoted with the Jewish Voice for Peace, which is, or like that statement, which is hardly where I stand. So maybe you could like kind of address both of those issues a little bit.
Yeah, no, you raised, Fred, you're like right on. These are like the two, like in many ways, like the most central points to what does it mean to navigate ourselves from this impossible position. So in terms of the question of power, force, agency, There's an Israeli saying. It's an Israeli saying, I both love and hate, or probably more accurately, love to hate, right? The saying goes, that which doesn't work with force will work with more force, right? That which doesn't work with force will work with more force. It's a statement that supposedly comes from like being in the Israeli army, like something's kind of broken. If it doesn't work, like just hit it really hard kind of thing, right? But that statement can be understood, for better or for worse, as a sort of mission statement of Zionism in general, at least the way Zionism has come to understand itself in the moment that it exists in right now. The question of agency, I want to note something. And I was actually thinking about this today. We tend to think of Jews before Zionism as if they were powerless, right? They were just bereft, powerless, couldn't do anything, total victims, right? Totally vulnerable, right? So I think a lot of that comes from the Shoah, legitimately from the Shoah, because the Shoah is a moment of absolute powerlessness, right? It is a moment where you are being marched to your death in industrial gas chambers, right? That is pure powerlessness. But Zionism could not have emerged if the Jewish people were purely powerless, right? Zionism as a political movement managed to get hundreds of thousands of Jews from across the world to this tiny plot of land, over, sometimes with supported by, but often over and against empires that didn't want it. And those Jews didn't just get to that little strip of land. They built something there. They built something real. A powerless people could not have done that, right? Like, there are plenty of peoples in the world who are powerless. They can't manage getting, millions of people from Africa to across the world to build something, right? The Jews could only do that on some level because they actually did have some measure of power. Now, they didn't have state power. They didn't have the political power that comes with being a majority, right? But they did have power. So one of the things we have to, Zionism couldn't have existed if they didn't have power. American slaves, right? They didn't have the power, right, to go, Liberia aside, they didn't have the power to go colonize a country and really build something, bringing millions of people together, right? The Jews did have power. They did have agency. Otherwise, Zionism couldn't have come into existence. But the problem is, as I said, I think in many ways we're haunted by the Holocaust, and we're haunted by the sense that agency is only a function of being able to fight back, of being able to hurt the people who hurt you.
Well, then also the dialectic of power, powerlessness is a very useful narrative.
Oh, of course.
The Zionist movement. I mean,
yes.
If you read David Bayal's book, Power and Powerlessness in Jewish History, he talks about how Jews have always,
yes.
at different points,
yes.
That this binary is necessarily false in his mind. Now, he's no great Zionist, but
no. So this is where Jabotinsky is important, because Jabotinsky is at Kishinev, the Kishinev pogrom, like days afterwards. He's a journalist. He's reporting on it. He sees it firsthand. He sees the horrors. Again, mirroring in many ways October 7th. And a pogrom is a moment of powerlessness, right? And he recognizes the Jewish condition is so profoundly vulnerable. But Jabotinsky's view of the world is that Jews can only exist if they carry around a big stick. If they carry around a stick that is bigger than everybody else, and they are willing to use it no matter what. Now, there's a certain truth to that, but if you reduce agency to the ability to hurt and destroy others, you're going to find very soon that you don't have the agency to build a better future, right? You said it yourself, right? The ability to reshape the Middle East through our own military power kind of reached its limit. And it reached its limit in Iran. I think we all just saw it, right? America and Israel doing what it did together still didn't dramatically change the Middle East. Might have even made it worse, right? We still don't know yet, right? So there's certainly a question of no longer looking at military force and violence as the only way to think about agency. If anything, it's a way to hide from taking the kind of responsibility that real agency requires by accepting constraints and then acting within those constraints. That's where real agency is to be found, I think. To your question about what does it mean to act, knowing that those actions can be used against you. So part of the reason I started writing these essays and published the book was that I was living in Israel. I was a rabbi in Israel. And Rabbi Fred Klein happens to be a colleague of mine, in case people didn't know. I saw American rabbis not be able to speak on any of this, right? There was a total silence. And I get it, because to speak meant essentially risking your words being weaponized at a time when Jews genuinely felt, even in America, that their security, their lives were, a certain sense, at risk. So I felt living in Israel that I had a responsibility to speak and try to name some of these things, because I didn't feel anybody else I knew my friends, my colleagues, my peers could, right? So again, there are moments where it really feels like you can't speak, but then we also have to look to those who can and still find those spaces where we can. To the question of our words being misused, this is exactly the point that I was getting at when I cited the German philosopher Hegel before. Remember I said before, Hegel says two conditions of action. One is you can't know the consequences, but number two is you don't get to control the meaning of your actions, which means you can do something intending one meaning and somebody else can take that action and impose a different meaning on it, which is essentially what you're saying, right? I signed that agreement. I signed the, if we're talking about the Rabbi Blau organized a statement against certain perspectives on the starvation of Gaza, right? Like I had a certain sense of what that statement meant because I read it, right? And what it was trying to do. But I don't get to control how that statement is used by others, who they associate it with, what message they see from it, right? And it's very disconcerting to act and see your actions, so to speak, totally be taken out of context. But here's the point that Hegel notes, and it's something we have to be willing to accept. That's politics. That's life, right? If you want to act and take responsibility, it means you're going to have to act and you're going to have to risk people misinterpreting you, people using you in destructive ways. Because there is no action without it. That's why most people don't do anything, right? That's why most people, for politics, it's performance, right? Politics is not about the risk of acting in ways that come with real costs, right? Political action is rare, real political action, because it is so risky, right? And to a certain extent, we've all kind of lost the ability to do that because it feels like the costs are so high if we get it wrong. But we also have to recognize what the costs are if we don't act at all. Maybe Gerald, and then I don't know if we have to wrap up. So maybe Gerald, if you want to do the last question.
Okay, thank you, Yasher Koyach. Wonderful, particularly the way you introduced it through the Rambam. That's a mitzvah that you have living in Israel, and you started to sound silver trumpets. You're not, as Rabbi Blau is, as the people in Small Emoni are doing, as my friend and teacher. I missed your talk with Chaim Seidler-Feller, Small Emoni here. But I think that's you started, you led us a little bit astray by comparing what happened on October 7th to what happened with the Nazis. I don't think the comparison is an apt comparison. I think as you're implying, and as presumably a commission would make clear, if it isn't clear already, the empowerment of Hamas is was a policy of the Israeli government.
Absolutely.
And we do have a tshuva, but the tshuva has to start a lot earlier, I think. And it's an obligation in the land of Israel. I think those of us who don't live in Israel have a lesser obligation in terms of this particular mitzvah, which is to recognize, I think, that the enemy who's attacking us in the land of Israel can be like a Moloch in the sense that it can be inside of us. That enemy could
let me be clear. The danger of Amalek,
not an external enemy. And Yeshayahu Leibovich was already talking about this, as was immediately after the Six-Day War. The occupation itself is what's attacking us, and is a cancer, and it has been a cancer from the time that Rabbi Seidler-Feller and others in the 70s were first talking along the lines. But it's wonderful to have your voice added to those other religious voices fulfilling this mitzvah that the Rambam made very, very clear, I think, as responsibility. If we're going to live in the land of Israel, we have to be ready to sound silver trumpets, even if the enemy is internal.
So I appreciate your words, Gerald. So I want to clarify a couple of things, just because I think you did touch on important points there. When I compare October 7th to the Holocaust, it is not in any material or literal sense, because it can't be, right? You can't compare 6 million dead to 700. It's not a comparison that should be made. It's grotesque in that way. But from the retrospective experience of it, right, the only context Jews have for sort of total powerlessness, and that is what, again, a pogrom is at its core, and what the show is at its core, right? We do lump them together. Now, I actually write in the book, right? The very attempt to sort of link October 7th to the Holocaust should be a sign that actually something is very wrong. And the reason I say this is because whatever October 7th was, you cannot compare it happening in a Jewish state, a real Jewish sovereign state with literal nuclear weapons to the Holocaust. Whatever powerlessness we felt on October 7th, we still had nukes. We didn't just have nukes. We got nukes on submarines. I hope that's, Israel's not supposed to acknowledge these things, but Israel has second strike capabilities, right? Which means like it can actually has even greater deterrence than people even realize, right? It's not like Israel is disappearing anytime soon. But knowing that as material facts and what it means to experience it are two separate things. But the challenge is in the aftermath is being able to get our heads screwed on straight, right? To actually recognize what we're dealing with and what we're not. In the terms of the question of responsibility, you're absolutely right. It goes long before October 7th, right? I mentioned Jabotinsky earlier. I mentioned the fact that Jabotinsky was deeply aware that the Zionist return to the land of Israel was inevitably going to produce resistance by the Arabs, the Palestinians who lived there, right? It wasn't a question of if, it was a question of when. He's very clear about this, right? One of the things that, and as I said before, the implication is if he was a Palestinian, he would do the same thing, right? Zionism, if it has an original sin, so to speak, right, is that it believed the Zionist return to the land of Israel could be done problem-free, right? That it could be done without creating massive consequences, right, for all sorts of peoples. I get that, right? When you're drowning, you don't think too hard about climbing into the lifeboat and what it might mean for the other people there, right? You're trying to survive. But at the same time, like as I keep saying, right, you have to recognize where you are within the situation. You have to recognize where your responsibility lies. You may not be guilty, but you are on some level responsible. And what Jabotinsky is admitting, whether he wants to or not, is on some level, Zionism is absolutely responsible for Palestinian response to it, right? Because it was, in a certain level, inevitable. Now, that doesn't mean just because Zionism has an original sin, so to speak, that it should be going away, right? One of the important things we learn about sin is that tshuva means life continues, right? Sin is not the end, right? That's one thing. There's another basic message of the Torah. Sin is never the end. Sin is just Tuesday, right? The question is how you respond to it, right? Tshuva enables you to bear your sin. That's the whole point of it. It enables the sin not to trap you, not to live within a world in which you can't acknowledge it, and it's forever controlling you, right? Who here has read Macbeth? Who has seen a movie of it, right? What happens to Macbeth over the course of the play, right? He becomes more and more trapped and haunted by his actions that he cannot acknowledge and fully recognize until they ultimately consume him, right? Tshuva is about bearing responsibility for what you've done, not so that you become erased, but so that you can actually have a real future, right? So that you can actually be the kind of person that acknowledges who you are, what you've done, and seeks to continue living because of it. And I can tell you, when Zionism, when you recognize that we have responsibility for this conflict in some way, Palestinians are not just permanently irrational and anti-Semitic, right? That there's some level of it that they kind of have a point, right? On some level, when you recognize that, you realize that maybe the way we've been going about this could look a little different, might look a little different, right? Because when you would look at them and you see maybe they're not crazy, right? There is a lot of crazy on our end too. But when you realize they may not all be crazy, right? It changes the way you potentially could think about yourself and how you respond. And until we are willing to sit with that deeper implication, that deeper responsibility, it's hard to imagine this land being the kind of place that gives the Jewish people a true future. As I said before, if you don't do tshuva when the crisis comes, been a lot of crises in the history of Zionism, right? If you don't do tshuva, it is the way of cruelty because you are condemning the future to the crisis ultimately returning.
Okay, thank you so much. We have to wrap up now, but I greatly appreciate everybody's participation and interest. And thank you so much, Rabbi, for your great nuanced views of these very complex issues. And we have greater conversations every time we're willing to discuss this further. So just to get people excited for our next classes, we have on June 1st, Rabbi Yitzchak Evan Shays, who's going to be presenting on Rav Kook's teachings on how to fix the entire world. And the next week, we have the pleasure of having Rav Yaakov Negin, who's going to be talking about Jewish-Muslim religious fraternity, past, present, and future. So some similar themes happening with those classes. and we would love to see you all there. But thank you so much for being here and for participating in our programming, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you also to Rav Shmuley again for creating a space like Uri L'Tzedek, where hard questions can be raised and real discussions can be had, because there are not many spaces in the Jewish world where we could have just had this kind of conversation right now. And again, I'm not Eliezer Ben Horkinus. I don't claim to know what God wants, but we at least got to be willing to ask the hard questions.
Yes, exactly. All right, well, have a great rest of your day, everybody, and continue to ask hard questions.